about getting itchy feet to go back to the front is a myth as far as I am concerned. In the Pacific, the military went to great lengths to protect him, and since his appeal depended so much on mixing with ordinary fighting men, his writing lost its quality. He represented his new assignment, and he angered the troops there by saying that the real fighting was in Europe, and that those in the Pacific theater had, quote, no conception whatsoever of what our war was like, end quote. He had a premonition that he was going to be killed, and he died from a sniper's bullet on the island of Iishima, renowned and rich, but lonely and frustrated, covering a war theater he did not want to know. It is interesting to imagine how someone like Pyle would have covered the last days of Germany, with the looting, the plundering, and the horror of the concentration camps. It was a difficult period for correspondence. The Russians were lyrical. "The night is coming to an end," wrote Vasily Grossman, who with the Red Army was closing in on Berlin. "The day will be ours, on break from the dawn. Let the guilty tremble." His colleague, Ilya Ehrenberg, continued to ignore the party line and call for vengeance. Quote, "The Germans have not been punished, but not enough. Who can stop us now? The hour of revenge has struck," end quote. The note of exultation appeared also in British and American reporting. Quote, "This is the greatest armed vehicle joyride in history," wrote Hyle Boyle of the United Press, as the Allied military machine rolled into the heart of the Third Reich. Those German correspondents still surviving were reduced to writing propaganda of the hang on, hold out, wait for the miracle weapon variety. The German public had long since stopped believing in newspapers or newsreels. Audiences watching films showed the Allied landings in Normandy being repulsed were actually German shots taken of the abortive Dieppe raid. It was thought, however, that readers might still have faith in the astrological column, so some PK men suffered the indignity of creating horoscopes that spoke of valleys of darkness to be passed through before the final triumph, and these were distributed to newspapers with orders to publish them. It was hard for a reader, in April 1945, to find a correspondent prepared to describe the grotesque heap of rubble that once was Germany, a correspondent whose reporting showed either a trace of pity for the conquered or any regret for the loss of compassion that the war brings to both sides. One such man, however, was V.S. Pritchett of the New Statesman and Nation. On April 7, 1945, Pritchett wrote, "We have become connoisseurs of ruin in this war. We have learned to distinguish between the bombed, the shelled, the burned, the blasted. But in England we have never seen a town that has been killed, completely written off and abandoned, a place as empty as Pompeii, that has the sour stench of a rubbish heap from one end to another, and where the only sound is the drip of water from the broken roofs. Disgust furs the tongue and sours the stomach. One does not pity the people of the town, nor does one hate them. One says, 'They did it to us,' but one is left just staring. The scene has gone beyond argument. The terrible thing is that one has no feeling at all. One is stripped of every feeling, the humane, the inhumane. The curiosity grows feeble. This is negation. The mind and heart have got to begin at the beginning again and learn all they knew once more." End quote. Pritchett described the Allied looting in Germany and succeeded in getting his story by the censor. William H. Stoneman of the Chicago Daily News was less successful. A dispatch he wrote about American looting at Jena, where the Zeiss Company had its headquarters, was held up until the war was over. Pritchett cleverly linked the looting to the absent victims. Quote, "It occurs to you the street is yours. Any street, any house. You have the lot. Climb over the wreckage, dig out a motor bicycle. Help me with the goddamn door. I've seen a lot of tools I want, boys. Wine glasses. What have you got? Anything in there? Books? Wine? Cameras? Some son of a bitch has been here before." You go in your boots, crunching the glass. You climb gingerly into a bedroom. The wardrobe has fallen onto the bed. What awful hats the woman wore. Why only one evening shoe? She read Tristan and Isolde. She hoarded face powder. Her child had a red engine. She did not finish knitting the jumper. End quote. It required correspondence of exceptional ability to convey the full horror of the concentration camps. The fact that such camps existed was not news. The British newspapers had reported in 1942 that over 1 million Jews had been killed since the outbreak of the war. Some details of the methods of execution had been published, and the Russian Ilya Ehrenberg had exposed some of the Red Army's terrible discoveries in a report in PM in August 1944, but many readers had tended to discount much of Ehrenberg's writing as propaganda because of his intense emotion over what the Germans had done to his country. Quote, "I cannot calmly write about what I see. A Tommy gun, not a pen is needed." End quote. Even as camp after camp was liberated, it was difficult for readers to believe that there was part of a deliberate and systematic policy of the German government. The disastrous effect of the Allied atrocity propaganda in the First World War was now fully realized. Horror stories about beastly, bloodthirsty Huns mutilating nuns and nurses and using bodies to make soap had appeared in newspapers between 1914 and 1918 and had later turned out to be lies. What guarantee had the reader in 1945 that the stories now about German concentration camps were not equally false? The correspondents did their best. The difficulty was to find a way of conveying the horror in a manner that carried conviction. Marguerite Higgins of the New York Herald Tribune, who, with Sergeant Peter First of Stars and Stripes, liberated Dachau, tried the hammer blow approach, written as an eyewitness account. She described how the newly liberated inmates beat one of the SS guards to death, and how, when they were again confined until they could be screened for typhus, quote, "in a suicidal protest against the quarantine edict, they flung themselves against the electrically charged fences, electrocuting themselves before our eyes." End quote. Ronald Monson, who was with the first troops to enter Belsen, the Wehrmacht had invited him to take the camp because it did not like what it had seen there, and also because it feared a cholera outbreak. Tried flat, unemotional description. But a few days after his article appeared, Monson found that a well-known British prisoner of war would not give him an interview because, the POWs said, "I don't want to talk to a correspondent who could write such lying propaganda about the Germans." Ed Murrow begged his audience to believe him. Quote, "I pray you to believe what I have said about Buchenwald. I reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words." End quote. Larry Salon of the London News Chronicle concentrated on the child inmates of Sandborstel camp. Their starved bodies and their eyes like coals burning in their starved gray faces bear witness to the greatest mass horror the world has ever seen. End quote. Gene Curvin of the New York Times came closest to writing a convincing report. Curvin arrived at Buchenwald several days after it had been liberated and was considering what was left for him to write about when he learned that the United States military authorities planned to force some 1,200 German civilians from the nearby city of Weimar to make a tour of the camp. Curvin wrote about this, and because his report contained a description of what the Germans were seeing with the description of the effect it had upon them, Buchenwald at last seemed real. Quote, "The stench, the filth, and the misery defied description," wrote Curvin, and he told how the German civilians fainted, wept, were sick, and went white and turned away in horror. But perhaps the concentration camps were beyond the power of any correspondent to convey fully to his listener or reader. Was Eisenhower watching Patton walk off to vomit after their tour of Ordorf Nord camp right in his assessment that, quote, "this is beyond the American mind to comprehend," end quote? Perhaps some French inmate of Buchenwald, a former Havas reporter, had the answer when he told Murrow, To write about this, you must have been here at least 2 years, and after that, you don't want to write anymore. Admitting all the problems that correspondents faced, it remains hard to reach any conclusion other than that the war could have been better reported. The main bar to this was the correspondent's inexcusable identification with the cause and his less excusable incorporation into the military machine. Apart from finding a style of reporting that did not bring up a correspondent into conflict with the military authorities, it is not easy to suggest what anyone could have done about this. Organized revolt or individual defiance achieved little. Two examples, Anzio in 1944 and the reporting of the German surrender, will suffice. An Allied bridgehead at Anzio on the coast below Rome, established in January 1944, met a heavy German counterattack. When the Allies were pressed, General Alexander, acting on orders from Churchill, closed down the radio transmitter that had been sending correspondence dispatches and imposed policy, in addition to security, censorship. Alexander said this was done because correspondents had been sending alarmist reports saying that Anzio could become another Dunkirk, but both British and American correspondents cabled protests to their newspapers, to the War Office in London, and to the Office of War Information in Washington. There were editorials of protest in newspapers, and the matter was raised in the House of Commons and taken up at a press conference in Washington with Secretary of War Stimson. But only when the military situation changed in the Allies' favor were transmission facilities restored, and policy censorship remained until the front was stabilized. Correspondents were left in no doubt about the position. To cheers in the Commons, Churchill said, quote, "No words such as desperate ought to be used about the position in a battle of this kind when they are false. Still less should they be used if they were true," end quote. In Washington, Stimson said that correspondents had been too pessimistic. Quote, "It would be a good plan in the future to remember the old adage, keep your shirt on," end quote. As the fighting in Europe drew to an end, 17 correspondents were selected by the SHAEF Public Relations Section, and on May 6, 1945, were flown to Reims to witness, on behalf of the world's press, Germany's surrender. The Chef press officer warned the correspondents that the announcement of the surrender would first be made by the heads of the governments concerned. Quote, "I pledge each one of you on his honor as a correspondent and as an assimilated officer of the United States Army, not to communicate the news until it's released on the order of the Public Relations Director of SHAEF. End quote. The surrender was signed in the early hours of May 7th. The SHAEF press officer wrote to the correspondents that orders had come in from, quote, a high political level, end quote, that the news would not be released until the following day at 8 p.m., when it would be announced simultaneously in Paris, London, Moscow, and Washington. The correspondents were worried by this, particularly the American news agency men. For them, being the first, even by a minute or two, was what the business was all about, and they did not believe that the embargo would hold for such a lengthy period. They protested, but were told that the decision was a political one and could not be changed. Edward Kennedy, an experienced war correspondent and at the time head of the Associated Press Paris Bureau, was the most disturbed. He had been the first correspondent into Bizerte in Tunisia, at some risk to his life, but then the army had made him toss a coin with other correspondents for first use of the limited telegraph facilities, and Kennedy had lost. He had been among the first correspondents into Paris, again at some risk, but the area was controlled by the Third Army, and Kennedy was with the unit of the 7th, so the censors would allow him to say nothing about his exploit. He had sat on the patent slapping story at Eisenhower's request, only to see it broken in the United States by columnist Drew Pearson. Now he found himself third in the queue for transmission facilities out of press headquarters in the Hotel Scribe in Paris. Boyd Lewis of the United Press had been the last man on the press plane at Reims and the first off at Paris. He was on the first jeep away from the airport and was first into the press center, and was first on not just one but all the telegraph outlets, thus blocking his rivals. James L. Kilgallen of the International News Service was second in line, having beaten Kennedy in the race to the press center by throwing his typewriter under Kennedy's legs. The final blow came when Kennedy and the other correspondents heard that SHAEF had ordered German government to announce the signing of the surrender, quote, by all possible means, end quote, and that German army radio had done so not in its code, but in the clear. Kennedy decided that the time had come to break the embargo, or, as Boyd Lewis, who still feels strongly about what happened, has put it, to impose his own ground rules and betray his colleagues, end quote. Kennedy went to the chief American censor and said, I give you warning that I'm going to send the story, end quote. Kennedy then used a complicated military telephone link that the censors had overlooked, put through a call to the AP office in London, and at 3:24 p.m. dictated, quote, Reims, France, May 7th. Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Western Allies and the Soviet Union at 2:41 a.m. French time today. The British censors raised no questions because they had been given no special instructions on surrender stories. Less than 10 minutes later, the story was around the world and wild victory celebrations had begun. For 4 hours, officials were silent. Then the British Ministry of Information stated that the official announcement would be at 3 p.m. on Tuesday, May 8th, which would be VE Day. Similar statements were made in Washington and Paris. All this confirmed that Kennedy's story is true and that it had forced the official announcement and that it was the scoop of the war. SHAEF, in an unprecedented action, immediately suspended the filing facilities of the American press throughout Europe and withdrew Kennedy's accreditation. 54 of Kennedy's fellow correspondents wrote to Eisenhower, We have respected the confidence placed in us by SHAEF, and as a result have suffered the most disgraceful, deliberate, and unethical double cross in the history of journalism. End quote. Eisenhower issued a statement deploring Kennedy's action, and the president of the AP apologized to the nation. On May 17th, Schaeff served Kennedy with his departure papers. He flew back to New York to a mixed reception. Many newspapers and most readers, who felt that they had the right to know the newspapers and could not see what the fuss was about, supported Kennedy, but his employers did not. When he waited in solitude in a New York hotel, increasingly morose, the Associated Press revived his case and finally offered to let him continue with the agency if he admitted that he had been wrong. Kennedy refused to do so and was fired. In 1948, a proposal was made to the United States Congress that a special decoration be awarded to those correspondents who went with Kennedy to Rheims and who then, quote, displayed the highest ideals of responsible journalism by keeping inviolate the pledge of confidence and military secrecy imposed upon them, end quote. This was the nub of the matter. Kennedy's sin had been to transgress on matters of military confidence and secrecy. If the correspondents were allowed to challenge the military in these areas, then their usefulness as, quote, assimilated officers or quasi-staff officers, to repeat Eisenhower's phrase, would be ended. Edward Kennedy found a place in journalism's history, but when he died, in an automobile accident in 1963, he was still nursing the bitterness he felt for the treatment he received in 1945. The early years of victory were no time to assess the role correspondents had played in the war, but if sufficient correspondents had undertaken a critical look at their performance, some improvement in the whole standard of war reporting might have followed. 30 years later, Charles Lynch, a Canadian who had been accredited to the British Army for Reuters, grasped the nettle. Quote, "It's humiliating to look back at what we wrote during the war. It was crap, and I don't excuse the Ernie Piles or the Alan Mooreheads. And I don't exclude the Ernie Piles or the Alan Mooreheads. We were a propaganda arm of our governments. At the start, we were censors enforced. At the start, the censors enforced that, but by the end, we were our own censors. We were cheerleaders. I suppose there wasn't an alternative at the time. It was total war. But for God's sake, let's not glorify our role. It wasn't good journalism. It wasn't journalism at all." End quote. And that is the end of that chapter. Thank you for joining us. And my apologies about Flower hijacking the stream. Here she wants to be seen. Alright, please like and subscribe.